All right, friends, buckle up, dim the lights, and maybe fire up a fan for that dramatic background hum, because tonight we're diving headfirst into the weird, wonderful, and slightly alarming world of medieval beauty standards. Spoiler alert, it was less glow up and more pale down. Back then, beauty wasn't about looking healthy, nope. It was about looking like you'd just come back from a light haunting. The ideal look? A complexion so ghostly it made snow look sun-kissed. Because in the Middle Ages, pale skin wasn't a health concern, it was a status symbol. The message was clear: I'm so wealthy, the sun and I are not on speaking terms. Unlike today, where a bit of a tan implies yoga retreats and green smoothies, back then a bronzed glow screamed, I work outdoors, which translated to I'm poor, which in turn meant not cute. Milking cows and planting turnips? Not fashionable, looking like you've never seen a vegetable garden in your life, top tier. And when we say pale, we don't mean a gentle porcelain finish, we mean see-through, vascular chic. A kind of ethereal glow that said, I may or may not be a friendly poltergeist, but alas, not everyone was born with ghostly genetics, so people improvised. Enter the miracle of white lead powder. Applied generously to the face, it gave that perfect cadaverous aesthetic and a bonus round of slow, inevitable poisoning. Because beauty is pain and apparently also arsenic. Still too tan for comfort? No worries. Some folks bleached their skin with vinegar-soaked cloths, while others whipped up DIY beauty masks of crushed pearls and egg whites. The result? Radiant, luminous skin that smelled faintly like breakfast. And let's not forget the finishing touches. Blue veins were sometimes painted onto the chest and arms to really sell the fragile woodland creature vibe, because nothing says noble and refined like looking like your circulatory system is about to file a complaint. Poets were totally on board too. They waxed lyrical about maidens as pale as milk, white as snow, or, my personal favourite, like the moon in winter, which basically means she looked like she might keel over if someone sneezed near her. But this wasn't just about looking good, it was about looking rich. Fragility was fashionable. If you appeared delicate enough to dissolve in the rain, you were clearly above things like manual labour or, say, functioning blood flow. Achieving this elite look took dedication, specifically the kind of dedication that involves slowly poisoning yourself with makeup. Because in the pursuit of medieval beauty, nature was a mere suggestion and white lead was the holy grail. So the next time you're applying your SPF, just be grateful you're not smearing toxic minerals on your face for the sake of looking like a stylish ghost. Progress. Yes, LEED. The very stuff we now use to seal off old buildings and make them super safe. But back in the day, LEED was the Beyoncé of beauty products. Picture this, a smooth, pale, matte finish that was basically medieval Instagram filter vibes. It was the medieval version of flawless foundation. Your skin looked radiant till it definitely didn't. How'd they make this magic potion? White lead powder was brewed by mixing vinegar with metal and letting it corrode into a white crust. This crust was then ground into a fine powder. Slap that on daily and bam! You look like a glowing aristocrat, complete with a secret death wish. If your face started flaking, blistering, or shedding like it was negotiating a diplomatic treaty, congratulations. The makeup was working, but wait, it wasn't a one-product wonder. Many added mercury-based rouge for a flush of colour or chalk dust to keep everything in place. And just for that extra glazed perfection, Egg whites were brushed on for a smooth porcelain sheen. Basically, if it came from an alchemist's shelf or a barn, someone was slathering it on their face in the name of elegance. The catch? Aside from the tiny problem of slow poisoning, these lead-based beauties caused everything from chronic fatigue and skin ulcers to hair loss and early death. Not exactly your typical skincare side effects listed on the box. But hey, when the alternative was looking like a peasant, medieval nobles chose the scenic route to the afterlife. Men weren't off the hook either. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Retry. This wasn't just some random castle fad. From England to France to Italy, noble ladies totally bought into the high forehead look, while poets and artists couldn't stop singing praises about women whose faces basically started near the crown of their heads. But hey, not everyone had the luxury or patience to tweeze themselves to forehead perfection. So, in true medieval MacGyver style, some ladies faked it by drawing their foreheads a bit higher and hiding the rest under headbands or veils. Yup, medieval contouring was a thing, just a lot more fabric involved. Back then, eyebrows weren't just overlooked, they were actively banished. Today, we celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and endless TikTok tutorials. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as nothing more than facial clutter. To hit the ideal look, women plucked their brows into near invisibility or erased them completely. Why? Because a smooth, bare forehead was the height of elegance, and any rogue hairs were like pesky weeds ruining a perfectly manicured garden. Some even went full throttle and shaved the entire brow area clean, making sure not a single hair dared to interrupt their alabaster glory. That level of commitment would make today's beauty influencers do a double take, especially since there were zero brow pencils around to redraw them. How did they do it? With tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or if they were feeling particularly brave or reckless, concoctions with quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Yes, arsenic, because nothing screams dedication like flirting with mild facial meltdown. And this wasn't just a passing whim. Medieval art, from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, shows noble women with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes framed by, well, nothing but skin. The vibe, either serene or slightly extraterrestrial, depending on the lighting. Interestingly, this eyebrow exile wasn't universal. In some parts of Europe, thin or lightly arched brows stuck around, especially thanks to Middle Eastern and Byzantine influences sneaking in through trade and war. But overall, the message was clear: if your eyebrows are visible, you're doing it wrong. Oh, and it wasn't just a ladies-only club. Men, especially those mingling in court circles, sometimes trimmed or groomed their brows to fit the refined aesthetic, though completely shaving them off was rare, unless, of course, they'd lost them in a particularly heated theological debate. So what's the takeaway? Medieval beauty wasn't about natural looks, it was all about curated, symbolic, and maybe a little angelic vibes. After all, angels in art rarely sport eyebrows. Coincidence? Maybe. But hey, it worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a bit of rosy colour in your cheeks was basically the medieval version of having a good filter. Subtle, charming, and preferably not indictable by the church. A perfect flush suggested you'd just heard a slightly naughty limerick, or been outside just long enough to almost get sun-kissed, but not tanned, because tanning, That was one holy eyebrow raise away from scandal. A delicate blush screamed, well, politely whispered, "Youth, fertility, and not dead yet." All hot commodities back then, especially if you were over the age of 28, which was considered pushing your luck in terms of visible vitality. But you couldn't just slather it on like medieval Instagram makeup. That would be vain, and vanity was like standing one powdered foot in sin's doorway. The church was not thrilled with women enhancing their God-given complexions unless, of course, they were nobles or blushing with a humility so pure it needed a theological footnote. Scholars are still squinting at that one. But women, oh, they got creative. Common ingredients for that "I woke up like this." Flush included beet juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, and, surprise, bugs. Yes, cochineal, that deep crimson hue, came from smooshed insects, because beauty, as always, asked for small sacrifices like dignity or entomological ethics. Some opted for the DIY version, pinching or rubbing their cheeks to simulate the look of being either flustered or lightly allergic to compliments. Others mixed up red ochre or wine sediment and dabbed it on in secret, dodging both pious watchdogs and nosy neighbors. If you were rich and had a high tolerance for irony, you might reach for something a little more luxe, like red lead or cinnabar. You know, the kind of ingredients that could give you a killer glow and then just kill you. But hey, dying early was worth it if people remembered you as pink-cheeked and socially impeccable. Application tools range from cloth and fingers to whatever was handy and not recently in a stew. Mirrors weren't exactly common, so most women relied on instinct, guesswork, and the occasional honest servant who wouldn't lie to spare your ego. Of course, if you overdid it, you risked being mistaken for a lady of the night, or worse, French. The horror. The aesthetic goal was always soft, angelic glow, not travelling puppet show. And if someone dared compliment your radiant complexion, the correct response was to pretend you had no idea what they were talking about and mumble something about the brisk wind. Even nuns sometimes dabbled, discreetly, of course. Only on feast days. Because what says devout servitude better than a dignified dab of beetroot behind the cloister walls? Meanwhile, over in the follicular department, your hair was expected to look like it had been kissed by a seraph or borrowed from a bottle marked Archangel number 5. Blonde hair, in particular, was the jackpot associated with youth, virtue, and divine approval. The Virgin Mary was often painted blonde, which, geographically speaking, was about as likely as her owning a ski chalet. But medieval painters weren't exactly concerned with historical accuracy when radiance was on the line. If you were born blonde, congratulations, you were considered blessed and may have escaped some chores, but, as is often the case, blondness faded with age. So naturally women turned to homegrown solutions and sometimes bubbling cauldrons to keep the holy highlight alive. Homemade hair lightening remedies back in the day, oh, they were nothing short of witchcraft meets pantry clean-out. Think saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lye. No, not the fibbing kind, but actual lye, as in the caustic stuff that could strip paint. The process? Slather it on like you're marinating a roast, then lounge under the sun in a method charmingly dubbed sunbasking. Ideal results required the patience of a saint and skin tougher than a barbecue grill. Some particularly bold recipes even called for urine. Whose? Let's just say that part of the formula was flexible. If it helped your locks catch the light like a halo, well, it was worth it. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that beauty has always walked hand in hand with mild revulsion. Hair texture also played a starring role. Loose, long, gently wavy locks were the medieval dream, preferably flowing down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxurious look came with a catch. It was strictly for the unmarried. Once you said "I do," your hair was basically treated like classified information. Veils, nets, and head wraps weren't just fashion. They were a marital lockdown for your scalp. For noble women, hair became a canvas for creativity. Braids, twists, buns. It was like an updo Olympics. And don't forget the accessories, silk ribbons, beads, and fine embroidery. Because nothing says "I've never touched a sheep in my life" quite like wearing a tapestry in your hair. Men didn't escape the follicular frenzy either. Though they weren't judged quite as harshly, a man with thick, golden locks was considered a walking poem. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle? Basically, medieval shampoo ads with swords. Hair, much like wealth, wasn't always flaunted, unless marriage was on the horizon. Then suddenly it became a strategic resource. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear it long and loose, a symbol of purity and virtue, unless it was too loose, in which case you risked looking like a forest nymph or an about-to-be sainted martyr. If in doubt, braid it gently and keep those maidenly vibes strong. But marriage changed everything. Your hair, gone from public life faster than you could say wimple. Congratulations. You had a husband and a moral duty to wrap those tresses tighter than a monk's wine stash. Enter the era of veils, nets, and enough linen to make a tent. It wasn't just modesty, it was pest control. These coverings shielded your hair from smoke, lice, and over-enthusiastic troubadours. The truly devout took layering to new heights. A coif, a snug little cap, might be worn under a veil, which was then pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped tightly under the chin. The final look? Think holy burrito, and that was exactly the aesthetic. Of course, modesty didn't mean boring. As with all things fashion, practicality eventually gave way to flair, and medieval headwear started getting a lot more ambitious. Gold-threaded nets, check. Veils starched into origami-level precision, absolutely. And for that extra flair, some noble ladies went all in with silk cages wrapped around their braids, decked out in jewels and teeny tiny bells, because apparently the height of grace is sounding like a festive cat every time you turn your head. In many medieval cultures, a woman's hair wasn't just hair, it was a moral compass. Cover it up and you were modest, virtuous, probably blessed. Let it flow freely after marriage and you might find yourself scandalously compared to a lady of ill repute, or worse, a Frenchwoman. But let's be honest, rules are meant to be bent, especially when style is on the line. Some rebellious trendsetters would let a single curl peek out from beneath their veils or opt for the fashion equivalent of a legal loophole. Gauzy, transparent coverings that technically counted as modest, but still flaunted those expensive dye jobs. Because if you're going to follow the rules, at least do it in high definition. Now, if medieval beauty had one golden rule, it was this: the higher, the nobler. And no, we're not talking about stiletto heels. Enter the hennin, those majestic, cone-shaped hats that look like someone turned a church spire into a fashion statement. By the 15th century, women across Europe, especially among the French and Burgundian elite, were all about cranial altitude. Some hennins soared over 2 feet tall. These weren't just hats, they were wearable status updates. The taller the hennin, the higher your rank, and the more door frames you collided with on your way to dinner. Crafted from luxe materials like silk, velvet, or brocade, hennins were reinforced with wire frames for that sleek, aerodynamic look, perfect for turning heads and catching low-flying birds. A delicate veil usually spilled from the tip, adding elegance, mystery, and a high likelihood of catching fire in a candlelit room. Fitting your hair under one of these medieval skyscrapers, that was a feat of engineering. Hair was braided, coiled, or in some cases completely shaved around the forehead. Why? Because nothing says fashion forward like sacrificing your hairline for better hat placement. And the hennin wasn't the only vertical madness in town. Some women rocked heart-shaped escapons, basically 2 giant croissants glued to either side of your head. Others flaunted butterfly hennins with veils that flared out like wings. Excellent for making a dramatic entrance, less so for windy days. Outside the world of aristocratic headgear experiments, most women stuck to the basics: veils, linen caps, and modest circlets. They were simpler, safer, and far less likely to be mistaken for medieval siege equipment. Predictably, the clergy and other moral gatekeepers weren't exactly thrilled with the sky-high hat craze. They warned that such excessive fashion could lead to vanity, sin, and perhaps a deeply unfortunate case of neck strain. But hey, when it came to medieval beauty, sometimes you had to suffer for status and occasionally duck to get through doorways. Despite all logic and perhaps good taste, hennins, those towering pointy head cones that looked like unicorn horns, went through a rebellious phase, remained the height of chic for anyone with the coin to spare. Much like many regrettable fashion trends throughout history, they were expensive, impractical, and somehow irresistible. Men, meanwhile, didn't get cone envy. They had their own medieval drip: feathered hats, fur-trimmed hoods, and shoes so pointy they doubled as medieval dueling weapons. If your footwear couldn't be used to joust a squirrel, were you even trying? Now, when it came to women's beauty ideals in the Middle Ages, the vibe wasn't Fitspo or curvy queen. Oh no. The ultimate goal was to resemble a fragile woodland creature who had just recovered from a dramatic fainting spell. The dream body, slim, soft, and gently glowing with the kind of mysterious energy you'd get from living on honey water, soft sighs, and unrequited love poems. Strength training? Absolutely not. Medieval beauty manuals didn't suggest lifting anything heavier than a silken veil, ideally in a coquettish flick before you looked away, perhaps to swoon. The aesthetic sweet spot was somewhere between too delicate to carry water and still able to strum a lute while perched on a velvet cushion. This whole ethereal look was, of course, tied to status. If you had muscles, it meant you used them, and if you used them, well, peasant alert. The goal was a narrow waist, soft curves, and the overall air of someone suffering from a mild case of divine ennui. Dresses were cut just under the bust to elongate the torso, making women appear taller, daintier, and one strong breeze away from a dramatic collapse. Need help with that illusion? Enter tight lacing, not full-blown corsets yet, but definitely a medieval cousin. Kirtles and cere were snug enough to keep everything in place while you floated around being vaguely poetic. Still, being too thin wasn't fashionable either. If you looked like you might be actively dying from plague or famine, it was considered a fashion faux pas. A touch of roundness, especially around the cheeks or hips, was seen as a sign of health, fertility, and the ability to survive winter without turning into a sad ballad. Diet advice of the era, let's just say it wouldn't pass modern nutritional standards. Think fennel for digestion, rose petals for fresh breath, and wine for a glowing complexion. Protein was fine, but preferably still feathered. Men, of course, were given a little more leeway. They could have broad shoulders, strong legs, and actually carry a sword without swooning. But even then, the upper crust didn't want their nobles looking like medieval gym rats. The ideal was lean, well-postured, and heroic enough to pose on a tapestry without breaking a sweat. And then there were the eyes, windows to the medieval soul, and the ultimate flirtation tool. Forget emojis, a single, soul-stirring glance was worth a whole courtship. Ideal eyes were large, luminous, and filled with the kind of silent virtue that whispered, "I have seen the fall of man, and still remembered to pray about it." Poets adored them. They wrote odes comparing beloved eyes to heavenly dew, moonlit pools, or tear-filled testaments to purity. What they didn't romanticize, bloodshot eyes from sleepless nights or allergic reactions to hay. Blue or grey eyes reigned supreme in Northern Europe, suggesting innocence, serenity, and the general vibe of someone who had definitely not seen anything scandalous, or at least was too well bred to mention it. In Southern Europe, dark eyes had their own fan club, especially if they came bundled with a noble family name and a dowry the size of a small vineyard. Enhancing those eyes, however, was no walk in the medieval park. There were no handy eyeliner pens, just soot, determination, and an optimistic disregard for eye safety. Some women would delicately dust black powder around their lashes to make their eyes look bigger. This occasionally worked, though more often it resulted in irritation, watery eyes, and what may have been history's first accidental smoky eye. Most women, however, relied on natural lighting and strategic positioning. Want to look doe-eyed and innocent? Stand next to a candle. Want to seem virtuous? Keep your gaze downward at all times, even if it means tripping over the family cat. Watery eyes were actually a win. They suggested emotional depth, religious devotion, or that you'd just wrapped up a moving session of prayer, or survived a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't around yet, but staring into smoke or enduring a mild public embarrassment generally did the trick. Eye contact, that was a medieval minefield. Too much, and you were flirting, scheming, or clearly French. Too little, and you looked guilty, possessed, or deeply suspicious. The sweet spot was a well-timed glance up from under your lashes, like someone who's memorized the scriptures but isn't about to make a big deal out of it. Now let's shift to a topic curiously absent from most medieval love songs: breath. Specifically, what it smelled like. While knights raved about their ladies' rosebud lips and teeth like tiny pearls, they usually left out what happened when those lips parted. And honestly, who could blame them? Dental hygiene was more of an abstract dream than a daily practice, and minty fresh hadn't been invented yet, unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping it rubbed off. Still, pleasant breath was the goal. A sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, vitality, and the likelihood that you hadn't just had garlic and eel for breakfast, though statistically you had. Women did what they could, chewing parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and even random twigs, not so much for the flavor, but to keep their breath from clearing rooms. Think of it as the pre-mint, pre-gum era's answer to Tic Tacs. It didn't whiten your teeth, but it made you slightly more kissable, or at least less alarming in close conversation. If you had access to an apothecary and some coin, you could snag fancy herbal mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were used sparingly, partly because they were pricey, and partly because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered, well, a bit forward. Toothbrushing as we know it didn't exist. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, scrubbed them with crushed herbs or chalk, or gnawed on chew sticks, fibrous twigs that doubled as both dental tools and stress relievers, while your suitor recited yet another poem about your elbow. And sure, halitosis wasn't a turn-on, but it wasn't scandalous either. Everyone had some degree of dragon breath. It was just another shared experience, like bad poetry readings or trying not to be executed for heresy. For highborn ladies, the goal was to glide through society, offending as few people as possible, gracefully, of course. Conversations happened at a safe, we're not touching distance. Public displays of affection were about as welcome as a goat at a tea party. And if you ever found yourself unsure of what to do, the winning move was to fan yourself thoughtfully, preferably while staring into the middle distance like you were composing a heartfelt poem or plotting a very polite escape. Bonus elegance points if you had a pomander, a delightful little orb filled with herbs that you could waft in your own direction when the aroma of medieval street got too real. Fast forward to today, and a dazzling smile can rack up swipes faster than a nobleman dodging taxes. But back in the Middle Ages, smiling was not something you just did willy-nilly. It was a high-risk, low-reward kind of move, best deployed sparingly, like spices or peasant uprisings. And to uprise, why the caution? Well, dental care back then was less routine maintenance and more grim lottery. Teeth were indeed useful, mostly for gnawing on hard bread, but they weren't exactly front and centre in the romance department. By age 30, many people's teeth looked like they'd lost several jousts with rocks. It wasn't just laziness either. Diets were basically a never-ending buffet of starch, bread, gruel, mead, everything you need for a mouthful of cavities and regrets, toothbrushes, floss, and fluoride, not invented yet. Sugar hadn't taken over the continent, but even humble grains turned traitorous in your mouth. And let's not even talk about dental procedures. Let's just say if someone approached your molars with a metal tool, you might consider making peace with your gods. Despite all this, a lovely smile was still appreciated, albeit silently, sort of like a good harp solo. Having straight, white teeth was a sign of youth, wealth, and possibly divine intervention. But no one was going around grinning like a medieval toothpaste model. The height of fashion was the closed-mouth smile, the kind that says, I may or may not be pondering a sonnet, rather than cheese. Some ladies went the extra mile and tried homemade dental powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral. These were a bit like brushing your teeth with seasoning and sand. Results were mixed, enthusiasm was moderate, and enamel damage was probable. For the most part, teeth were like distant relatives, tolerated but not something you'd showcase in public. Medieval artwork almost never shows people smiling with their teeth. Even saints and angels seem to have agreed on a divine no-teeth policy. After all, even heavenly beings weren't above playing it safe. Men weren't off the hook either. Sure, a knight could win hearts with his bravery, shining armor, and moody poetry, but no bard ever sang, his molars shone like moonlit pearls. That's why troubadours stuck to praising eyes, hair, and hands, areas far less likely to betray a diet of porridge and dental despair. The ideal medieval man had a look. Tall, lean, shoulders broad enough to carry a sword and possibly a few societal expectations. But he couldn't look too eager, like he'd just leapt off a hay wagon in excitement. No, the perfect man was one who looked like he could either charge into battle or quietly write a sonnet about it from a safe distance. A man who was effortlessly noble, vaguely poetic, and, most importantly, unbothered by the state of his molars. Not too ripped, that screamed peasant who lifts things, but not soft either, that whispered, "I nap professionally." The ideal look was somewhere in between, like you could swing a sword if, say, the squire called in sick. A chiseled jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose with a height of hotness. Think medieval prince in a golden manuscript, not the guy who just finished stacking hay. Facial hair? Acceptable, as long as it looked like a choice. A neatly trimmed beard said gallant knight. A scraggly one said I wrestled a raccoon in the woods and lost. Clean-shaven was equally fashionable depending on the region, as long as your face didn't scream I've been missing for 3 weeks. Hair? Shoulder length and styled. We're talking soft waves or elegant curls that looked totally natural. Read, achieved with heated sticks and suspiciously fancy herbal concoctions. Yes, men curled their hair with actual curling irons, because what better way to declare your noble superiority than by spending an hour getting your bangs fluffed by an underpaid page? Fashion did a lot of heavy lifting when it came to male hotness. Padded shoulders and cinched waists turned you into a walking, gliding triangle of aristocratic perfection. Posture mattered. A nobleman didn't just walk into a room, he floated, possibly with a smirk that suggested he owned the room and the village 2 towns over. Naturally buff. That was fine, as long as you earned those biceps by swinging a sword in a war, not by carrying sacks of grain. War hero equals sexy. Barrel hauler equals peasant chic, not in a good way. The goal was to look fabulous without looking like you tried. You weren't hot because you worked at it. You were hot because you were born to be. Call it medieval, effortless elegance. Instead of a gym membership, you had land rights and a falcon named Rupert. Now, hygiene. A slippery topic because in a world where bathing was more of a suggestion and plumbing was still a Latin noun, managing body odor was creative. Not exactly a spritz of designer perfume, more like medieval Febreze, featuring herbs, oils, and whatever smelled better than plague. Enter the scent grenade, also known as a pomander. A tiny metal orb worn on a chain or pinned to your clothes, packed with herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and something mysteriously titled powder of roses. Equal parts accessory and olfactory armor, these things were your first line of defense against the medieval stench offensive. So there you have it, the look of medieval male perfection, styled to the gods, scented like a spice market, and strong enough to fight, but only if someone important was watching. Imagine strolling through medieval Europe armed not with a fragrance-free lifestyle, but with the 14th century equivalent of a freezy grenade. The elite were all about scent, perfumed gloves, delicately scented handkerchiefs, and even combs that wafted fragrance as you battled knots and lice. Hair? Absolutely fair game. Folks occasionally spritzed it with floral water or vinegar infusions, which at best smelled better than pure human misery, and at worst like a salad left in the sun. Now, before you assume everyone smelled like a blooming garden, spoiler alert, they didn't. People sweated heavily. Between the thick woolen garments, blazing summer sun, and a complete lack of armpit science, medieval folks were marinating in their own humanity. Enter linen, the medieval MVP. It soaked up sweat and could actually be washed, unlike those fancy silk or woolen overcoats that probably saw more moths than soap. Some people got creative, tucking herbal sachets into their underclothes in a fragrant attempt to cancel out the odor effer. Bathing was a thing sometimes. Early and late medieval periods saw the rise of bathhouses, but the fun didn't last. The church started throwing serious side-eye at communal nudity, which really put a damper on scrub-a-dub enthusiasm. The result? Dry bathing. Yes, that is as delightful as it sounds. Wipe yourself down with a cloth, splash on some scented water, and pretend you've achieved something. Meanwhile, the overachievers among them went the extra mile, stuffing flower petals into their shoes or herbs into their bed linens, hoping to fool others, and possibly themselves, into thinking they'd recently visited a garden instead of a pigsty. But scent wasn't just about personal hygiene, it was about image. An image in medieval Europe was a moral minefield. Beauty wasn't just about good lighting and symmetrical cheekbones. It was divine, suspicious, weaponized, or demonic, sometimes all in the same sentence. If you were pretty, it meant God liked you. You were pure, virtuous, probably wouldn't steal livestock, and might even get a decent dowry. Your face could be your passport to social elevation, or at least to being less ignored at feasts. But here's the rub. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, used it, suddenly you were suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember. Too much mirror time and boom. You were one fluttered eyelash away from being accused of pride, seduction, or something horrifyingly French. Sermons warned that a woman's beauty could lead men straight into sin, which naturally was entirely the woman's fault. Eve had set the tone, and medieval Europe clung to that narrative with biblical determination. Makeup? Suspicious. Hair peeking out from under a veil? Scandalous. A coy glance at the wrong time of day. Witchcraft, yes, actual witchcraft. People truly believed that beauty might be an illusion conjured by sorcery to lead righteous men astray. Sound a bit dramatic? Well, this was a time when being blamed for a hailstorm could get you toasted at the nearest stake. And if you weren't conventionally attractive, that didn't let you off the hook either. Being plain or having unfortunate features could be seen as a sign of divine disappointment, or worse, a moral failing. In some circles, your face was your spiritual report card. Beauty meant grace. Ugliness meant punishment, illness, or that heaven had definitely unfriended you. So yes, in medieval Europe, appearance mattered a lot. Whether you smelled like lavender or layered despair, whether your face could launch 1,000 ships or merely a dozen whispers of bless her heart, your look was never just skin deep. It was practically a theological statement. Naturally, all this made things about as clear as a mud puddle during a rainstorm. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Radiate virtue, but not so brightly that it starts to smell like pride. And whatever you do, never outshine the local lord's wife. That little faux pas had a tendency to end with you in a conveniently located convent, or suddenly developing a highly suspicious case of the oops, she's dead. So medieval beauty standards, not just about looking good, oh no. This was Olympic-level moral gymnastics, pirouetting between modesty and magnificence, teetering on the edge of vanity and virtue, all while dabbing powdered lead on your face like it wasn't slowly poisoning you. Charming. Now, shifting from powdered nobles to powdered enemies, let's talk Persian immortals. These guys weren't just soldiers, they were an ancient flex. a living, marching billboard for imperial swagger. Born during the reign of Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, they strutted onto the stage just as Persia was leveling up from regional player to full-blown empire boss mode. Cyrus, sharp as ever, realized that empires don't run on vibes alone. You need bureaucrats, sure, but also a dream team that can dazzle the people, crush the rebels, and strike fear into anyone thinking of skipping their taxes. Enter the Immortals. The name wasn't just for show, it was a masterstroke of logistics and psychological warfare. According to Herodotus, a man who never let facts get in the way of a good story, their numbers were always exactly 10,000. One dies, bam, another takes his place. Get injured, replaced, stub your toe, honestly, probably replaced. To outsiders, it looked like this force could not shrink, falter, or, most importantly, die. Immortality by head count. Now let's be clear, this wasn't just some rando army, no sir. You didn't just stumble into the Immortals because you owned a spear and had nothing better to do. These were hand-picked elites, drawn from noble Persian families, or at least the sort who could be trusted not to flinch in battle or sell state secrets for a kebab. Training began early. Discipline, brutal, loyalty, non-negotiable. They weren't just expected to fight, they were supposed to represent the pinnacle of order, obedience, and the kind of stoic cool that made lesser men sweat through their sandals. And they look the part too. We're talking finely woven robes draped over scale armor, armed to the teeth with spears, bows, short swords, and those classic wicker shields. These weren't just soldiers, they were fashion-forward death machines. When a Persian king deployed the Immortals, he wasn't just sending troops, he was unleashing a moving metaphor, a silk and steel TED talk on why you don't mess with Persia. From the vast plains of Lydia to the scorching deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire spread its wings, the Immortals were right there, like the Empire's ultimate hype squad. These weren't just any soldiers, you saw them, and you witnessed the Empire's heartbeat, steady and unbreakable. Immortals didn't blink, didn't retreat, and definitely didn't quit. That's what made them downright terrifying. Their arrival wasn't some random coincidence, it was pure psychological warfare. Forget shiny Greek hoplites decked out head to toe in bronze. The Immortals looked like a wave of finely dressed shadows rolling across the land, mysterious and mesmerizing. Their uniforms were a perfect blend of regal flair and battlefield practicality. Think richly embroidered tunics and trousers in deep reds and purples, colors that screamed royalty and don't mess with me. Underneath all that style was scale armor made from bronze or iron, flexible enough to move like ninjas, but tough enough to make you think twice about getting up close. Their shields, woven wicker, lightweight, but surprisingly good at turning arrows and sword swings into mere annoyances, and their crown jewel, literally, was the soft, felt cap called a tiara, sometimes pulled down over their faces to keep their identities as mysterious as their motives. Unlike the Greeks, who celebrated individual glory like it was an Olympic sport, the Immortals thrived on uniformity. Imagine 10,000 soldiers moving in near silence, all looking like clones in matching gear, a living, breathing curtain of doom descending on the battlefield. Each carried a short spear, a bow, with arrows and a short sword or belt knife, ready for anything. But here's the kicker, these guys were lightning fast and deadly no matter where they fought. Their training focused on agility and endurance, not just raw muscle. They could march across entire provinces without losing formation. Talk about squad goals. Whether battling in open fields or standing guard in royal courts, they adapted seamlessly. Their gear was light enough for speed, but lethal enough to intimidate and destroy. It wasn't about brute strength, it was about flawless consistency. Never faltering, never staggering, never looking vulnerable. That eerie perfection paired with their shadowy, mysterious look cemented their legendary status. When they marched into battle, drums thundered and dust clouds billowed, but their faces? Stone cold and focused. No shouting, no chest thumping, just an unsettling, synchronized precision. It was as if they weren't men at all, but machines forged from discipline, ritual, and pure, unshakable fear. Facing the immortals wasn't just a matter of flirting with death. It was like staring into the abyss and realizing the abyss has better discipline, sharper arrows, and a stricter bedtime routine. These guys weren't just soldiers. Being an immortal was part warrior, part fashion icon, part prisoner of routine. Sure, they got all the perks, free housing, food, clothing, but not out of generosity. Oh no, that was the Empire's way of saying, "Welcome to the machine. You now belong to us." Once they signed up, these men didn't belong to their families anymore. They were property of the Empire. Most of them were born into Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, though the occasional overachieving peasant's kid could earn a spot if they were disciplined enough to make a monk look like a party animal. Training started early. We're talking childhood. Think of military boot camp, but with fewer juice boxes and more horseback archery. These boys were taught how to suffer with style, ignore pain, ignore hunger, march in terrifying synchronization, and obey orders like their lives and promotions depended on it. Spoiler alert, they did. Glory seeking? Nope. Personal ambition? Hard pass. The moment someone got too flashy, the group stepped in and reminded them what team spirit really meant. The formation was sacred, and unity was law. The daily schedule was tighter than a drum. Up before dawn, silent drills, weapon maintenance, and not a single snooze button in sight. Meals were eaten together. Nothing fancy. Think of it as ancient performance fuel, meat, flatbread, dates, and wine. Tasty? Sometimes. Luxurious? Never. The Empire wanted warriors, not brunch influencers. When they weren't marching off to war, they were busy guarding the king like very polite, extremely lethal shadows. But their job wasn't just to look intimidating. They sniffed out conspiracies, watched nobles for any sign of rebellion, and kept the peace in the Empire's most chaotic corners. Just seeing one in the room could make a loudmouth noble suddenly remember his manners. These guys were like ancient secret agents with better armor. They could smell a lie, spot fear, and eliminate threats before anyone even realized there was a threat. Surprisingly, they weren't complete recluses. They could get married and have homes, but settle down was a relative term. The moment duty called, they had to drop everything and disappear like well-trained ghosts. No complaints, no delays, no, "Sorry, I have a dentist appointment." Because in the world of the immortals, loyalty wasn't part of the job, it was the job. A man who hesitated even once, outside, gone, quietly swapped like a dull blade, because the number always had to be 10,000, not 9,999, not 10,001. No gaps, no delays, just pure, unrelenting precision. This wasn't just a fighting force, it was a living, breathing machine of myth. These folks didn't just follow discipline, they were discipline. They were Empire's favorite tools, honed, polished, sharpened, until all that was left was one thing: duty. If Cyrus the Great had the bright idea to invent them, it was Darius the Great who cranked the dial up to 11. When he grabbed the throne in 522 BCE, thanks to a dash of palace drama and a sprinkle of assassination, he needed something more than a crown to keep people in line. Enter the Immortals. No longer just the king's fancy bodyguards, they were now woven right into the Empire's administrative guts. Think secretaries with spears, but terrifying. Darius knew real power wasn't just about swinging swords, it was about making people believe you'd already won. And nothing sold that illusion better than a shiny, disciplined wall of 10,000 identical soldiers. He trotted them out for festivals, posed them like action figures around his new capital, Pipiles, and sent them on VIP missions. Always seen, always calm, always the same. The Immortals weren't just soldiers, they were a 10,000-piece walking billboard for Persian dominance. But Darius didn't stop at PR. He gave them a tactical makeover too. These weren't your granddad's Immortals. Under his rule, they became the Swiss army knife of ancient warfare. Elite infantry that could play nice with archers, cavalry, even chariots. Darius loved strategic flexibility, and that meant the Immortals had to level up. More training, more skills, more terrifying efficiency. Greek accounts tell of these warriors creeping across battlefields like a slow-moving storm, arrows flying in synchronized waves, wicker shields up, formations tighter than your aunt's Tupperware drawer. They also took on a new job, rebellion squashing. With an empire stretching from Egypt to the Indus Valley, there were always fires to put out. In places like Elam, Babylon, and Tyre, the Immortals were often the first thing a rebel saw, and the last. They didn't just crush uprisings, they broadcasted consequences, a living memo from the king: "We see you. We will end you." Under Darius, the Immortals got a darker edge, not just elite troops, but symbols of fear, order, and royal vengeance. Even their art got an upgrade. In the stone reliefs at Pepilolis, they appear in flawless formation, identical, unyielding, eternal. Not portraits, not individuals, just the cold, silent gaze of power carved into eternity. They were walking propaganda. Darius didn't just want his subjects to respect him, he wanted them to feel the cold steel of his authority without a single word spoken. Enter the Immortals, an elite force that was always present, always armed, and, according to legend, never died. Cross the line and you wouldn't just meet trouble, you'd meet 1 or 10,000 very angry, very shiny problems. Under Darius, the Immortals weren't just soldiers, they were fear with a wardrobe budget. Think terrifying death machines, but accessorized with gold and discipline. These weren't just guys with spears, they were the glittering shadow of the Empire, deployed like a surgical scalpel in a silk glove. Their legend hit its high note under Xerxes the Great, and if there was one place that really stress-tested their reputation, it was the rocky meat grinder known as the Pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This wasn't just a battlefield, it was a cosmic showdown. On one side, the Persian Empire with all its order, grandeur, and imperial flexing. On the other, the fiercely independent Greek city-states, armed with bronze, sass, and just enough hubris to make a god wince. And right in the middle of it all stood the Immortals. Xerxes' pride and paranoia rolled into one gleaming battalion. When Xerxes marched into Greece with what ancient sources claimed was the biggest army to ever stomp across the earth, He made sure the immortals were front and center. Not just his bodyguards, they were his statement piece. A velvet-gloved punch to the solar plexus of rebellion. The Greeks, naturally, had heard all about the immortals. 10,000 warriors who supposedly couldn't die, served like clockwork, and probably flossed with gold thread. But at Thermopylae they ran into a buzzsaw made of muscle, bronze, and very pointy sticks. King Leonidas and his few thousand Greeks, most famously, those grumpy gym bros known as the 300 Spartans, dug in like a tick in a tiger. Xerxes, a bit miffed that mere mortals were still standing, sent in the immortals to finish the job on day 2. He expected a theatrical stomp, a choreographed curb stomp of Greek resistance. What he got was a mess. The narrow pass made the immortals' usual tactics as useful as a spoon in a sword fight. Their fancy bows were cramped. Their shorter spears couldn't reach past the long stabbing sticks, or dory, of the Greek hoplites. And the Spartans weren't just angry, they were professionally angry. Trained from childhood to fight like a wall with teeth, the Greeks held their ground in tight, brutal phalanxes. The immortals, for all their elegance and training, bled a lot. Even the historian Herodotus, who never met a dramatic detail he didn't like, noted with a hint of glee that they weren't doing any better than the regular troops. It wasn't just a battlefield embarrassment, it was a full-blown PR crisis. The immortals, once seen as war gods wrapped in silk and iron, had been humanized, and at Thermopylae they weren't untouchable. They were mortal. They died. Yep, dead as a doornail. And just like that, the myth of their immortality got a rude awakening, courtesy of some very pointy Spartan spears and a whole lot of Greek sass. But even in defeat, these guys didn't just roll over and vanish. Nope. They adjusted their helmets, tightened their sandals, and got right back to it. Because immortality, as it turns out, isn't about being unkillable, it's about being unshakable. Sure, their training was impressive, their tactics sharp as a sword tip, but the real jaw-dropper wasn't their fighting style, it was their system. These so-called immortals weren't kept alive by sorcery or some divine hotline to the gods. No, their secret weapon was, wait for it, bureaucracy, cold, calculated, clipboard-wielding efficiency. Here's how it worked. One immortal kicks the bucket, whether in battle, from old age, or just from deciding he's had enough stabbing for a lifetime, and poof, he's instantly replaced. No funerals, no farewell speeches, not even a fruit basket, just a flawless swap out. The head count always stayed at exactly 10,000, not more, not less. 10,000, period. And no, this wasn't a poetic flourish or some ancient PR stunt. It was a finely oiled system engineered by the ever-organized Achaemenid Empire. These folks didn't just wing it, they ran on spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed. Behind those 10,000 spears stood an even bigger army of record keepers, trainers, and quartermasters who made sure every immortal had the right sword, shield, snack pack, and clean socks. Aspiring immortals were groomed in the capital like action figures on standby, fed, drilled, and cycled through lesser gigs until someone in the main squad took a tumble. When a post opened up, a replacement was already halfway into his boots before the vacancy paperwork had dried. Overseeing all this were the Hazara parties, literally bosses of 1,000, each responsible for a slice of the immortal pie. Beneath them was a tangled but terrifyingly efficient web of sub-commanders, clerks, and logistical masterminds who made sure the gears never stopped turning. Soldier down in Egypt, replacement en route, twisted ankle in media, backups already halfway there with a rolled bandage and a bad attitude. But this wasn't just military micromanagement, it was psychological warfare. The never-shrinking, always replenished army gave off serious, we're eternal vibes. 10,000 warriors forever unchanged like the world's deadliest office rota. It wasn't just fearsome error in message stream retry. If you took one down, another popped up like clockwork. Who they were didn't matter. Names, personal stories, all irrelevant. What counted was the role, eternal, untouchable, unblinking. Like some silk-draped, highly disciplined hydra, these immortals kept marching because the machine behind them didn't stop, not for loss. Not for sorrow, not for anything. Grief wasn't on the schedule. Even outside the battlefield, the system purred along without a hiccup. If one of these guys had a family that started getting a little too cozy with rebellious ideas, or just said the wrong thing at the wrong dinner, they'd be quietly swapped out. No scandal, no drama, just next. The line moved on like nothing had ever happened. It wasn't about honor or valor. It was about persistence. The real power of the immortals wasn't their combat skills or their courage. It was the terrifying fact that you couldn't actually get rid of them. Ever. Sure, people remember them as warriors, but they were a lot more than that. Think of them as armored diplomats, Persian elegance wrapped in gold thread tunics and perfectly silent synchronization. In the imperial mindset, military presence wasn't just about conquering cities. It was about existing loudly without saying a word. The immortals weren't just sent to fight, they were sent to be seen. Picture it, a handful of them strolling into a Greek or Babylonian city, not stomping in with clunky boots and blood-crusted gear. Oh no, they wore silk, gold, velvet-like headdresses. They moved in eerie harmony, didn't speak, didn't flinch. They didn't have to bark threats, they were the threat, just by being there. In the provinces, they were stationed like human reminders. Hey, remember who's in charge? They didn't usually mess with local politics, but everyone knew they were watching. Just a whisper of rebellion and, bam, a knock at the governor's door from 10 guys who never blink. Most uprisings never got off the ground. Why? Because staring down the immortals was like staring into a velvet-wrapped abyss. And it blinked first, never. Even back at court, these guys didn't exactly clock out. Sure, they held spears at festivals and smiled for coronations, but behind the embroidered robes they were sniffing out traitors and making sure the king's orders weren't treated as suggestions. Some historians even suggest they were a kind of ancient security agency, equal parts bodyguard, secret police, and silent guilt trip in human form. That was their genius. They weren't just warriors, they were chess pieces in a much bigger imperial game. War, just one of many tools. The real magic was how they turned silk and silence into power. Their empire wasn't just held together by swords, it was glued by symbols and swagger. The so-called immortals knew that fear and awe are basically siblings at a family reunion. Wherever they showed up, in distant palaces or fancy foreign courts, the message was loud and clear. The king's eyes are everywhere. The empire is forever. Resistance? Not worth the hassle. They waged wars without ever drawing a blade, like some ancient version of psychological warfare on steroids. But, like all empires and their legends, time had other plans. By the twilight years of this grand empire, the immortals were still respected, still feared, but no longer the untouchable gods they once were. The machine that made them immortal didn't crash spectacularly. It just started to squeak and rust, slow and steady. As the kings got cozier with silk robes and court gossip than with the muddy battlefield, the immortals followed suit. No longer fierce warriors, they became more like royal accessories under rulers who preferred gold to grit. The elite guard still marched in perfect formation, still wore the flashy uniforms, but the cracks were showing. Recruitment standards? Sliding downhill faster than a greased pig at a county fair. Political favoritism turned the sacred 10,000 into a playground for noble nepotism. Instead of the toughest, most loyal fighters, you got sons of privilege who looked the part but lacked the guts. The result? A force that was all uniform, no fire. Discipline without heart. Then came the big showdown, Alexander the Great crashing the party in 334 BCE. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the immortals stood firm next to the Persian king, but even their courage couldn't stop Alexander's Macedonian army from slicing and dicing through their lines. Outflanked, outsmarted, and overwhelmed. And the worst blow? Their legendary status shattered like cheap pottery. For centuries, the name Immortals inspired trembling respect. But Gaugamela proved they were shadows of their former selves, no longer the ironclad force of Cyrus or Xerxes' day. The magic replacement system, the one that made their losses vanish like Houdini, had fizzled out. No quick fixes, no instant backups. The unit never bounced back. When Alexander marched into the royal palace, it was more ghost town than fortress. The immortals weren't there to stop him. The unbreakable line had finally snapped. But their story didn't end with a dramatic defeat and a sad curtain call. Nope. Bits and pieces of these legendary immortals lived on like an eternal meme. Alexander the Great, being the trendsetter he was, borrowed heavily from Persian traditions to beef up his own army. Fast forward to the Sasanian Empire and voila, a new elite squad rose from the ashes, sometimes dubbed Immortals by the history buffs. Not the original crew, but close enough to stir up that legendary vibe. 10,000 strong, elite, intimidating, and basically eternal. Even in their downfall, these immortals left a masterclass in how to build more than just a fighting force. They built a legend. The Persian immortals may have disappeared from the battlefield, but their influence? Oh, it stuck around like that catchy tune you just can't shake. Long after their empire crumbled, generals, kings, and storytellers couldn't stop obsessing over the idea of an unbreakable, elite fighting squad. Why? Because it wasn't about winning every fight. It was about what they represented, the perfect, state-controlled machine. An army that didn't age, didn't question orders, and didn't waver. The Greeks, of course, were both awestruck and a little creeped out. Herodotus called them immortals, not because they were invincible. Spoiler, they definitely could be killed. But because whenever one fell, another stepped in instantly. Their presence was constant, unshakable, almost ghostly. For the Greeks, who were used to the chaos and messiness of war, these immortals were downright alien, precise, faceless, and disciplined to the point of being almost superhuman. Centuries later, the Romans still nodded respectfully at the immortals when talking about ancient power, and Byzantine historians admired the Persian elite guard's ironclad structure. Early Islamic chroniclers told tales of those 10,000 spear wielders, their weapons glittering like a silver forest beneath the blazing desert sun. The idea didn't stop there. The Sasanian Empire brought the concept back with a cavalry unit historians sometimes call the New Immortals. Not blood relatives of the original, but definitely carrying the same vibe, an armoured fist of imperial might. Even Napoleon, a guy who studied every bit of military genius he could get his hands on, gave Persian military organisation a thumbs up. Culturally, the Immortals slipped into myth and pop culture, often twisted into monsters, demons, or shadowy assassins in modern media. But the real story? Far more fascinating. They were human, terrifyingly, brutally human. Ordinary guys transformed into legendary weapons of empire through relentless training, mental conditioning, and a well-oiled system that never skipped a beat. No magic, no supernatural powers, just pure, consistent excellence and silence. That's how you become immortal. Their deadliest weapon, not a sword, not a spear, not even an intimidating battle cry. No, their real weapon was the idea that they were always coming, like a permanent thundercloud on the edge of the horizon. That's how legends are born. The Immortals didn't need to live forever, they just needed people to think they did. And so they live on, etched in stone, studied in military strategy, and whispered about in the nightmares of anyone who knows that a relentless, well-organized force can look a lot like immortality. Long before Greek stories spun tales of fierce warrior women, there were the Scythians, nomadic badasses of the Eurasian steppe. From the Black Sea to the Alai Mountains, their reputation galloped ahead of them. And here's the kicker. Scythian women weren't stuck back at camp weaving blankets or watching the kids. Nope. They were out there on horseback, drawing bows, and charging into battle like they had something to prove, and spoiler alert, they proved it. And they weren't tagging along behind the men either. They led, they fought, they killed, with style, with precision, with absolutely no chill. This wasn't a rare exception, it was Tuesday. It was normal. Greek historians like Herodotus were completely flawed. Imagine showing up expecting to meet some quiet shepherd folk and finding out the lady of the house won't marry you unless she's personally bagged an enemy soldier. That's what he wrote. At the time, people probably chalked it up to ancient gossip. But then archaeologists started digging up burial mounds, kurgans, across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia. And what did they find? Women with war wounds, armed to the teeth, bows, arrows, swords, the whole deadly accessory set. One woman had an arrowhead in her spine, armor still on, surrounded by grave goods that said, "Yes, I meant business." These weren't decorative weapons. They were used, she was used, to end people. Scythian society flipped the script on ancient gender roles. Life on the steppe wasn't a gentle stroll. You had to move fast, hunt well, and fight even better. Boys and girls learned to shoot arrows around the same time they learned to walk. Everyone wore leather pants, battle gear, and hairdos that made them hard to tell apart in the chaos of a cavalry charge. Tattoos? Check. Attitude? Double check. Their world didn't demand a choice between warrior and woman. You could be both. A Scythian woman could slice you in half before breakfast, then perform sacred rites before dinner. The battlefield had no gender, the hearth still did. And while the mythical Amazons were fading into bedtime stories, the Scythians were out there giving Greek soldiers panic attacks. They fought the Persians, they clashed with the Greeks. Even Alexander's Macedonians had to think twice. And far away, in a small kingdom in what's now Benin, West Africa, another army of fierce women was sharpening their blades. They didn't need anyone's permission to be powerful either. European colonizers learned that the hard way. History's full of warrior women who didn't wait to be written into legend. They made sure to carve their names into it, preferably with a blade. They were called the Aogi, but the French, ever fans of a good metaphor, dubbed them the Dahomey Amazons, a nod to the fierce ladies of Greek myth. Except these women weren't myth, they were very, very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, these warriors, known properly as the Agogoji, weren't just hanging around the palace looking tough. They were the palace. As the elite royal guard of the King of Dahomey, they weren't there to hand out grapes and wave fans. They were trained to kill, defend, and never, ever retreat. Sure, they may have started out as elephant hunters or palace attendants, but let's just say their career trajectory took a dramatic turn. Recruited as young girls for their strength, fire, or sheer don't mess with me energy, they were pulled from their families and plunged into training so intense it would make modern boot camp look like summer camp. We're talking obstacle courses filled with thorns, sparring with real blades, and blood-sworn oaths of celibacy and unshakable loyalty to the king. Romantic weekends off, not in this job description. Dressed in braided sashes and armed to the teeth with muskets, machetes, and clubs, the Agogoji were terrifying. But their most dangerous weapon? Psychological warfare. Imagine facing down someone who calmly slices open your comrade's throat, wipes her blade clean like she's just done the dishes, and keeps coming. That's not just intimidation, it's nightmare fuel. European observers in the 19th century couldn't believe what they were seeing. One French officer reportedly watched in stunned horror as an Agogoji warrior rushed a man, cut him down, and then strolled off like it was just another Tuesday. These women weren't ceremonial mascots. They were frontline shock troops deployed in raids, ambushes, and full-on battles. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars of the 1890s, the Agogoji went head-to-head with French colonial forces. Outnumbered and massively outgunned, they didn't back down. They launched night raids, pulled off ambushes, and fought tooth and nail in the streets to defend their homeland. Their ferocity forced French commanders to rethink not just their strategies, but their entire understanding of gender roles in warfare. But their significance went beyond the battlefield. In a deeply patriarchal world, the Agogoji carved out a space of autonomy and influence that was as sharp as their blades. They advise. But then comes the boom. The next line drops like a war drum in a quiet room. She wasn't just pretty, she was terrifyingly good with a bow. And don't even think of underestimating her with a sword. This woman was worth a whole battalion on her own. Lethal and lovely, not opposites. She was the full package, a beautiful hurricane in armor. Tomo didn't just hang around campfires waiting for updates from the front. She was the front. She rode under the command of a fearsome warlord who may or may not have been more than just her boss, eyebrow raise, during his ambitious power grab for Kyoto. She wasn't there to patch up wounds or serve tea. She was leading charges, cracking helmets, and, according to some accounts, carving her way through enemies like it was personal. Fast forward to the Battle of Owazu, 1184. Her side surrounded, the warlord makes his last stand. A lesser mortal might have run. Not Tomo. Oh no. She looked that chaos square in the face and decided it was her time to shine. One of her most legendary moments? She yanked a charging enemy off his horse, wrestled him down like it was a judo championship, and then, bam, beheaded him like she was slicing daikon for dinner. Then she casually climbed back onto her horse and rode straight into the madness, cool as a glacier. Was it exaggerated, maybe? Maybe not. But the story stuck for centuries because something about that steel-nerved ferocity hits different. What happened to her after the dust settled? That's the kicker, nobody knows. Some say she was captured and forced into a quiet domestic life. Others claim she found peace in a monastery, trading the sword for silence. And then there are those who think she simply vanished, ghost-like, slipping into legend as if history itself couldn't hold her. Regardless of what really happened, Tomo's legacy lived on, etched into plays, stories, and the collective memory of a culture that didn't usually leave room for warrior women. In a world laser-focused on keeping women boxed in, Tomo broke the mold, blade in hand, fear nowhere to be found. She wasn't just fighting for her commander, she was fighting for the right to exist in a world that told her not to. Now hop in your time machine and swing over to the 1st century CE, where Rome was flexing hard, disciplined, relentless, and convinced nothing could touch them. Enter Boudica, tall, terrifying, and very, very angry. This flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia didn't just rattle the Roman Empire, she kicked it right in the marble columns. She was married to Prasutagus, a king who played nice with Rome, mostly because they let him. But when he died, Rome tossed out his will like old takeout and tried to snatch up his lands. As a bonus horror, they flogged Boudica publicly and, according to ancient sources, assaulted her daughters. It was meant to send a message, it did. The message was, war is coming. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica lit the rebellion match and torched everything in sight. She united angry tribes like a punk rock manager assembling a band, and then led one of the most devastating uprisings Rome had ever faced. She wasn't sitting in the back giving pep talks, she was out front, standing tall in her chariot, spear gleaming, hair blazing like fire, draped in a flowing tunic, and a gold torque so big it probably had its own gravity. She was fury in motion, calling her people to battle like a storm calls thunder. Boudica wasn't just a warrior queen, she was vengeance on wheels. She was part priestess, part general, and 100% pure fury. When she rolled into Camillum, what we now call Colchester, her forces didn't just visit, they turned the place into a bonfire party, burning it to the ground. Next stop, Londinium, the humble seed that grew into modern London. There she didn't just wage war, she slaughtered Roman colonists and took over the city like a boss. Historians estimate she wiped out over 70,000 Romans and their pals in just a few months. Talk about making a statement. Her army left behind nothing but ash and shattered egos. But the Romans, led by Governor Gas Suetonius Paulinus, yes, his name sounds like a Roman cologne, weren't down for the count. Outnumbered but not outsmarted, they tricked her into a big showdown where good old Roman discipline and battle formations won the day. The rebellion was crushed, and faced with defeat, she allegedly swallowed poison rather than get taken captive. Her uprising may have failed, but her legend, oh, that only grew. Roman historians called her a barbarian, but a fierce, unforgettable one. For the British, especially centuries later, she became the ultimate symbol of standing up to tyranny, whether foreign or homegrown. Meanwhile, far away in the dusty, war-torn steppes of Central Asia, during the golden age of Mongol expansion, a different kind of legend emerged. This wasn't a lady with a sword. This was a woman who terrified warriors and embarrassed princes with sheer, raw physical dominance. Meet Kutalun, the great-great-granddaughter of the one and only Genghis Khan. But she wasn't content just riding in his shadow. No, she built her own legend, one headlock at a time. Born around 1260 CE, Kutalun was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin and rival to Kublai Khan for the Mongol throne. Raised like a warrior prince, she mastered archery, horse riding, and battlefield tactics. But her true claim to fame? Wrestling. Among the Mongols, wrestling was serious business, and she was the queen of the ring. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Kutalun declared she'd only marry a man who could beat her in a wrestling match. Spoiler, nobody did. Dozens of suitors tried, lost, and left humiliated. Some even bet horses' gold and herds on their chances. She reportedly won herself 10,000 horses, making her not just a wrestling champ, but one of the richest women on the steppe. But she wasn't just throwing dudes to the dirt for kicks. Kutalun fought alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and smashing enemy lines. In campaigns against rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, she was Kaidu's top military advisor. He even thought about naming her his successor, quite the curveball in a culture ruled by male warlords. Unsurprisingly, this caused a stir. Some Mongol nobles whispered that her power was unnatural, a threat to the old boys' club. In the end, Kaidu passed the crown to a male relative. But Kutalun's reputation didn't fade. Even Marco Polo mentioned a fierce Mongol princess who fought like a tiger, could ride and shoot just as well as any man. Two women, two worlds, both rewriting the rules with fire and ferocity. Later on, history tried to either paint her as a lovesick damsel or shrink her story into mere legend. But make no mistake, Kutalun was the real deal, and her strength? Legendary. She proved that in the heart of the most male-dominated empire on earth, a woman could rise, not because anyone gave her permission, but because nobody could stop her. Picture this: a time when women couldn't vote, couldn't own land freely, and couldn't even slip into men's clothes without risking arrest. Yet this French teenager didn't just wear armor, she commanded armies. Meet Yonavar, born in 1412 in a tiny village called Domi. Illiterate peasant girl? Check. By 17, though. She was leading troops, staring down kings and flipping the script of the 100 Years' War between France and England. No fancy military training, no noble bloodline, just a claim of divine inspiration. She said she heard voices, saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, telling her she was chosen to boot the English out of France and crown Charles the Dauphin King. Pretty wild claim, right? Should have been a quick ticket to the loony bin. Instead, it got her a meeting with the future King Charles III. The court threw everything they had at her. The clergy grilled her for weeks, expecting her to fold. But no, she passed their test. They saw something: conviction, charisma, a spark no one could explain. So there she was, dressed head to toe in gleaming white armor, banner flying like a boss, sent off to Orléans, a city under siege and the war's crucial turning point. French commanders were skeptical, but Joan's very presence reignited their spirit. She didn't just watch from the sidelines, she led charges, dodged arrows, and rallied troops while bullets whizzed by. Against all odds, the French lifted the siege. The nation went electric. Joan earned the nickname the Maid of Orléans, becoming a living symbol of divine favor and fierce patriotism. After more victories, she escorted Charles to his coronation in rams, just as those saintly voices had promised. But with fame and power come enemies. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, English allies, and put on trial for heresy, witchcraft, and, get this, wearing male clothes, a death-worthy crime back then. At just 19, she was burned alive in Rouen marketplace. But her death, it only fueled her legend. Years later, the church overturned her conviction. Centuries on, she was canonized as a saint. Meanwhile, across the world, as Japan rushed into modernity in the late 1860s, Nakano Tiko took up her naginata, the bladed polearm favored by samurai women. With the samurai class fading, she made one last stand for the old ways, etching her name in history as the final true Onugata, a female warrior of samurai tradition. Nano came into the world in 1847, born into a prestigious family that somehow managed to balance brains and blades. While most kids were learning their ABCs, Nano was knee-deep in Confucian philosophy, perfecting her calligraphy and, most importantly, swinging a naginata like a pro. Now the naginata isn't just a fancy spear with flair, it was the traditional weapon of choice for samurai-class women. Think of it as the elegant multi-tool of battlefield ballet, graceful, deadly, and with a reach that said, back up. Her adoptive father, a martial arts master with a heart of steel and probably the patience of a saint, trained her until she could hold her own against any man in town. By her 20s, Nano wasn't just kicking butt, she was teaching others how to do it too. Equal parts educator and enforcer, she was essentially a sword-wielding TED Talk in Hakama pants. Then came 1868. The Boshin War erupted, pitting imperial forces against the Tokugawa shogunate. Did Nano stay home and crochet? Absolutely not. When her domain of Aizu became one of the final samurai strongholds, Nano stepped up. Technically, women weren't allowed in combat. Nano heard that, laughed, and said, "Hold my naginata." She formed her own rogue squad of female fighters, unofficial, unstoppable, and totally badass. They called themselves the Women's Army. Dressed in traditional armor and hakama, they didn't just support the men, they fought right beside them, blades clashing, spirits unyielding. During the brutal Battle of Aizu, Nano led her warriors into close-quarters combat against rifle-toting imperial troops. Eyewitnesses say she personally took down several enemies before a bullet to the chest brought her down. Knowing what awaited captured women, she made one final harrowing request. Her sister behead her, a warrior's death on her own terms. She was buried at a temple in Fukushima, her beloved naginata laid beside her. Today, statues stand in her honor, especially in Aizu, where she's remembered not just as a fighter, but as a woman who stared down death, modernity, and a patriarchy-heavy playbook, and sliced it all in half. Now fast forward, she operated with nerves of steel, a level of patience that could make a monk look fidgety, and an unshakable loathing for the invaders. Her kill count? Let's just say it climbed so high that military brass decided she was too lethal for the battlefield and sent her on a diplomatic tour instead. Basically, a world tour minus the concerts, hitting the US, Canada, and the UK. There, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and struck up a friendship with the First Lady, who was clearly impressed by her cool-headedness and brainpower. During the tour, she gave fiery speeches demanding the Allies stop dragging their boots and open a second front in Europe. As for the journalists who asked her dainty questions about lipstick and skirt lengths, she roasted them with sharp wit that could probably double as a bayonet. After the war, she didn't fade into the background or vanish into a quiet cottage life. Nope, she got her degree, became a historian, and started shaping the next generation of snipers. Yes, the war left scars, physical and mental, but her legacy endured like an old battle flag still flying high. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal and is still hailed as a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that constantly second-guesses women's roles in war, she didn't waste breath arguing. She just did the job and did it better than almost anyone else, period. And for every legendary name like hers, or Boudica, or Tomo Gozen, there are countless other warrior women whose stories got lost somewhere between the footnotes and the forgotten. History, as it turns out, had a serious case of man-writing syndrome. When women grabbed swords, rifles, or spears, they were often erased, reduced, or rebranded as myths. But let's be clear, they were always there, across continents, across centuries, often fighting in silence, not by choice, but because the scribes weren't paying attention. Take the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Ni, who led a full-blown rebellion against Chinese rule in the 1st century CE. These women didn't just organize a protest, they rode elephants into battle, amassed an army, and ran their own kingdom for 3 years before overwhelming Chinese forces shut it down. Their courage is still honored with temples and festivals, even if global textbooks keep hitting snooze on their legacy. Or look at the Queen Mother of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, Ya Asantewa. In 1900, when the British came demanding the Ashanti's sacred golden stool, think the literal throne of the people, she basically said, "Over my dead body." She gave blazing speeches, led troops into battle, and proved that defiance doesn't come with a dress code. There were also the Viking shield maidens. Were they as common as Norse legends suggest? Probably not. Were they real? Archaeology says yes. Graves with weapons, armor, even war horses, not as decorative props, but as signs of true warriors. And in the American Southwest, you had women like Lozen, an Apache spiritual warrior who rode and fought alongside her brother, the famed leader Victorio. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a protector, a strategist, a symbol of resistance. From lone rebels to royal leaders, from queens to peasant warriors, women have fought, often not to conquer, but to defend what mattered most: family, homeland, culture. They didn't wait for permission, they didn't ask to be remembered, but they fought anyway. Now finally, their stories are coming back into the light. Through academic research, documentaries, and pop culture retellings, these warrior women are reclaiming their rightful place in history. And each name we rediscover reminds us, history isn't just what was written, it's also what was ignored. And the women? They were never silent, they were silenced. Big difference. It's not just about what was remembered, it's also about what got quietly swept under history's giant rug. These women weren't asking for fanfare or marble statues, they wanted respect. And, finally, people are starting to pay attention. Now let's rewind a few thousand years and drop into ancient Mesopotamia in what is today Iraq. Back then, music wasn't just something you played to pass the time. It was serious business, ritual, power, even a kind of language. And at the center of this musical magic show, the lyre. This wasn't your average backyard guitar. The Mesopotamian lyre is one of the oldest stringed instruments known to humankind. over 4,500 years old. It popped up in Sumer, a city where music was part of everything from temple rites to royal shindigs. These lyres weren't just slapped together with whatever wood was lying around. Oh no, they were masterworks, decorated with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and artistic flourishes that screamed high status. Animal motifs, of course. Got to impress both the gods and your guests. One of the showstoppers was a lyre with a bull's head, unearthed in the 1920s in a royal tomb by a very enthusiastic archaeologist. This thing was decked out, a soundbox shaped like a bull's torso, golden face, lapis beard, basically the Elton John of ancient instruments. But it wasn't just there to look fabulous. The bull was a symbol of strength and probably had spiritual significance. And this wasn't just bling, it was cosmic bling, played with fingers or a little plucker, called a plectrum, if you want to sound fancy. The lyre made haunting, resonant sounds. We may not have the original mixtapes, but scholars believe the Sumerians used a 7-note scale, very similar to the scales we still use today. And yes, we've got receipts, ancient clay tablets covered in what might be the oldest known sheet music. Lyres didn't just serenade kings. In temples, they accompanied prayers and offerings to big-name deities like Inanna and Enlil. These weren't just songs, they were musical phone calls to the divine. Lyres even played a part in funerals, mourning the dead and guiding souls into the afterlife. Think of them as the spiritual Uber of ancient Mesopotamia. Musicians back then, total pros. Some were high-ranking priestesses, others were court entertainers. They memorized ridiculously complex pieces, learning the ropes in schools dedicated to scribes and musicians. It was music school before music school was cool. Today, we've got reconstructions of these ancient lyres being plucked in museums. Their soft, twangy tones echo across millennia, reminding us that way before Bach, bardic ballads, or Homeric karaoke sessions, humans were stringing up instruments and chasing beauty through sound in the desert. While the Mesopotamian lyre crooned sweetly to the gods, the ancient Greeks were over there making noise with something a little louder. Enter the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument with the volume of a full-blown existential crisis. This wasn't some dainty flute. It was raw, wild and emotional, as subtle as a chariot crash. For the Greeks, music wasn't just a hobby, it was ethos, a force that shaped your soul. The alos, an instrument that didn't just make music, it practically screamed with ancient chaos. Unlike its goody two-shoes cousin the lyre, which sang the praises of harmony, logic, and probably doing your taxes on time, Apollo approved, the alos was firmly in the camp of Dionysus, the god of wine, wild parties, and forgetting where you left your toga. This double-barreled beast consisted of 2 pipes, often crafted from wood, bone, or ivory, because nothing says cult ritual like blowing into animal parts. Each pipe had its own reed and finger holes, and players didn't just alternate between them, they played both at once. That's right, 1 mouth, 2 pipes. It was less concert flute and more drunken bagpipe, with a sound that could pierce armor and stir souls, or at least get soldiers to march in sync. Playing the alos was no joke. It required something called circular breathing, a technique where the musician inhales through their nose while simultaneously pushing air out through their cheeks. The result? Music without end. And a face that puffed up like a startled pufferfish. In fact, ancient athletes used to poke fun at these musicians for looking like they were halfway through blowing up an air mattress. But mockery aside, Alos players were highly respected. Think rock stars with lungs of steel and cheeks of thunder. You didn't bring out the aloes to play a soothing lullaby. No, this was the soundtrack of Greek drama and battlefield brawls. In theatres, it backed the heavy hitters, tragedies and comedies by the likes of Sophocles and Euripides, injecting raw emotion and dramatic flair. On the battlefield, it kept hoplites in line, its shrill notes cutting through the clamour of combat. And, during Dionysian rituals, it transformed dancers into whirling maniacs, blurring the line between performance and possession. Even Plato, who treated the aloes like it was the emotional equivalent of setting your scrolls on fire, couldn't deny its power. He much preferred the calm, rational tones of the lyre and the kithara, instruments that sat politely in the corner, sipping tea. But the aloes? That instrument could cry, rage, seduce and exalt, all in the space of a single breath. Today the aloes lives on in museum fragments and modern reconstructions that only hint at its wild, untamed energy. Unlike the precision-crafted lyre, the aloes wasn't about symmetry or control, it was about letting go. It was the raw, visceral sound of ecstasy, grief, desire and war. Meanwhile, in ancient China, where music wasn't just sound but a deeply philosophical pursuit, two instruments reigned supreme in the scholarly world, the qin and the guzheng. At a glance, they might seem like cousins, but each had its own role in shaping the nation's sonic soul. The qin was the older, wiser one, over 3,000 years old and radiating the quiet confidence of someone who's read all the classics and brewed the perfect cup of tea. With 7 strings and a long, fretless body, the qin didn't shout, it whispered. Its tones were subtle and delicate, sounding like rain tapping gently on a centuries-old roof. To the casual listener, it might seem like the instrument was playing hide-and-seek with the notes. But to Chinese philosophers and scholars, every gentle slide and harmonic spoke volumes about the cosmos. Confucius himself was said to be a fan, believing that playing the qin wasn't just an artistic pursuit, it was a moral one. Learning the qin wasn't about applause or fame, it was about introspection, balance, and tuning your soul to the frequency of the universe. Let's dive into the tale of 2 ancient stringed dynamos, the refined and chill gwin, and its louder, flashier cousin, the guzheng. Picture the gwin as the wise, quiet librarian of instruments, soft-spoken, elegant, perfect for whispering deep thoughts and soulful poetry. Meanwhile, the guzheng is like that extroverted relative who shows up at the party with 16 to 21 or more strings, ready to steal the spotlight with flashy solos and dramatic slides. The guzheng's curved wooden frame and movable bridges give musicians the freedom to unleash rich melodies and wild glissandos that sound like waterfalls of shimmering notes. Players pluck the strings with little picks, glued to their fingers, crafting cascades of sound that captivate crowds. This beast of an instrument was a crowd pleaser, gracing palace halls, folk festivals, and even the chaos of military camps. If the gwin was about meditative introspection, think poetry readings, philosophy talks, and Zen moments, the guzheng was all about high-energy banquets, operas, and epic storytelling. It could mimic galloping horses, babbling rivers, or sorrowful lovers, all through the magic of vibrating silk strings and masterful finger work. In ancient China, these instruments also carried a bit of social flair. The gwin was the go-to for scholarly gentlemen, while the guzheng found its spotlight with female performers, especially as time went on. Both earned respect, featured in music academies, and even earned a spot in Confucian ideals of balanced education. Fast forward to today, and both still strum their way through classical and modern tunes, echoing China's ancient soul, where music wasn't just sound, it was a gateway to virtue and deep feeling. Now, let's teleport to ancient Egypt, where music was far from mere background noise. It was sacred magic, a divine conversation weaving through temples, tombs, and everyday life. From mighty pharaohs to hard-working peasants, music was everywhere, calming workers, honoring the dead, guiding rituals, and bringing joy to life's moments. One star of this soundscape was the harp. Early harps curved like bows and evolved into grand angular beasts, towering as tall as a human. Temple musicians and royal entertainers plucked these strings not just for art, but to ease souls into the afterlife. Tomb paintings show harpists serenading the departed on their eternal journey. Then there was the sirum, a sacred metal rattle linked to the goddess of music, motherhood, and joy. This jangly instrument wasn't subtle, but that was the point. Shaken in temples to cool gods, cleanse spaces, and scare off bad vibes, the sirum's clanging was believed to keep cosmic order intact. Add to the mix breathy flutes made from reed or bone, floating haunting melodies through processions and rituals, and you have a symphony as vast and varied as the mighty Nile itself. Ancient Egyptian music wasn't just played, it was lived, breathed, and revered as a bridge between mortals and the divine. Picture this, a double clarinet with two pipes blowing simultaneously, creating a rich buzzing harmony that was basically the ancient ancestor of Greek oos. Percussion wasn't just a background beat either. Frame drums, hand clappers, and even castanets joined the party, especially during dances and festivals. In ancient Egypt, professional musicians were like rock stars, and some of the most respected were women. You'd often see them in art as harpists and singers, usually hanging out at temples. But these women weren't just there to entertain, they were the chantresses of Ammon, the musicians of Isis, basically spiritual powerhouses. Music was a way to honor gods, accompany offerings, and even mark the transition between life and death. Now, Egyptian musical notation is a bit of a mystery. Unlike Mesopotamia or Greece, not many written records survive. But no worries, their instruments, vividly carved and painted in tombs and temples, tell the story loud and clear. Ancient Egyptians got that music wasn't just sound, it was structure, emotion, and straight-up magic. Even in death, music mattered. They buried instruments with the elite, believing these tunes would play on in the afterlife's field of reeds, the ultimate Egyptian paradise. For them, music wasn't a hobby, it was the language of eternity. Zoom out to ancient Africa, where long before history was scribbled on stone, something even more primal was king: rhythm. Drums weren't just instruments, they were voices. They talked, commanded attention, remembered history, and summoned spirits. Across the continent, percussion was a living, breathing language carrying stories, laws, identities, and the very pulse of the divine. Drums came in all shapes and sizes, but the superstar was the talking drum of West Africa. Shaped like an hourglass with leather cords, this clever drum could mimic the tonal languages of the people. Skilled drummers didn't just bang, they spoke entire phrases by tightening and loosening the chords while striking with a curved stick. This was ancient wireless communication, sending messages about births, deaths, warnings, or royal invites across villages faster than any pigeon. But drums weren't just practical, they were deeply spiritual. In kingdoms like Kush and No, drums called on ancestors and gods. In places like Efa and Benin, they honored kings and deities during lavish court rituals. Drumming was the heartbeat of initiation ceremonies, healing rites, and funerals. It was said that beating a sacred drum could wake forces from beyond the veil. African drums came in countless forms, each with a story, a purpose, and a pulse that connected the earthly with the divine. Let's talk ancient beats and breezy ballads, because history had rhythm, and it was funky long before DJs hit the scene. First up, the drum squad: djembe, dundun, bugarabu, and kidi. Each had its own job in the percussive pecking order, like co-workers who actually knew how to keep a beat. These drums weren't just slapped together, oh no, they were carved from single logs, hollowed out with the precision of a neurosurgeon, then covered in animal hide and tuned like the world's most hardcore xylophone. Making one of these babies wasn't just craftsmanship, it was practically a sacred rite, with secret dad-to-son drum lore passed down like magical rhythm scrolls. But the fun didn't stop with drums. African rhythm was a buffet of sound: rattles, bells, shakers, thumb pianos. If it made noise, it joined the party. The result? A layered polyrhythmic soundscape so complex that Western music stared at it for centuries, blinking in confusion. In African tradition, music wasn't just a soundtrack, it was a full-body workout. You didn't sit quietly nodding your head. You danced, you sweated, you became the music. The drummer wasn't there to entertain you. He was more like a spiritual DJ, mixing ancestral memory and raw energy into every beat. These rhythms didn't stay put either. They packed their bags and journeyed through trans-Saharan trade routes, up the Nile, and eventually, heartbreakingly, across the Atlantic with the slave trade. And everywhere they went, from Brazil to the Caribbean, they left a rhythmic fingerprint. But no matter where the beat wandered, its soul stayed rooted in Africa, where music wasn't a hobby, it was identity, history, survival. Now hop over to the Andean mountains, where the air's so thin you can high-five a cloud. Here, music wasn't about skin and string, it was about wind. Ancient Andean civilizations like the Nazca, Moche, and Inca mastered the art of the aerophone, flutes, whistles, and the ever-iconic secu, aka panpipes. These instruments might look like a bunch of bamboo stuck together by a particularly crafty mountain goat, but don't be fooled. Each pipe was a single note, and when played together in rapid-fire switching between rows, it created a sound like the mountain was whispering secrets back to you. And the duets. Oh yes, the secu was a team sport. Two players would split a melody like a musical game of hot potato, a technique called hocketing. It wasn't just a cool trick, it symbolized duality, harmony, and all that good cosmic balance stuff the Andes were into. Flutes weren't just for melodies either. Some were carved from bone, clay, or reed, decorated to look like birds, snakes, or mystical spirits. These weren't just instruments, they were spiritual walkie-talkies, connecting humans to nature and the divine. One of the wildest inventions, the ceramic whistling vessels. Yep, pots that whistle when you pour water into them. These ancient Andean noise machines didn't just gurgle, they sang. Picture a teapot doing opera. These were likely used in rituals that blended air, water, and sound into a full-on sacred concert. And for the Inca, music was everywhere. Birth, there's a tune for that. Farming, better believe there's a beat. War, worship, weddings, and weeping all had their own soundtrack. They didn't just play music, they offered it, breathing melodies to the gods like Ini, the sun, and Pachamama, the earth herself. So next time you're tapping a beat or whistling a tune, just remember, our ancestors weren't messing around. They didn't just make music, they lived it. Even ancient soldiers didn't just march, they practically danced to perfectly timed flute tunes, turning battles into full-on ritual ballets. Though the Spanish nearly wiped out many native traditions, the soulful wail of Andean flutes refused to disappear. Today, those haunting notes still drift through the highlands of Peru and the villages of Bolivia, an age-old song of stone, wind, and sky whispering in the thin mountain air. Meanwhile, in ancient India, music wasn't just entertainment, it was cosmic engineering at its finest. According to Hindu philosophy, the universe itself sprang from sound, the primordial vibration called Om. From that cosmic hum blossomed one of the world's most complex and enduring musical traditions, steeped in ritual, math, and spiritual transformation. Way back in the day, sacred texts like the Vedas, dating to around 1500 BCE, contained hymns known as saman chants, which weren't just read aloud, they were sung with precision. These melodies were carefully crafted to sync your soul with divine energies. The priestly Brahmins weren't just philosophers and fire-offering experts, they were vocal athletes, trained in pitch, cadence, and the serious art of not messing up a note, since a single slip could, in theory, ruin the entire ritual. Instruments back then weren't mere tools, they were cosmic symbols. Take the veena, a plucked string instrument with a gourd resonator. It was, and still is, a symbol of wisdom and divine expression linked to Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge and arts. Its strings supposedly vibrated with the cosmos itself, letting players tap into universal truths through music. Then there's the bansuri, the bamboo flute, which wasn't just about melody, it was myth in motion. Lord Krishna, the god of love and mischief, was often shown playing this flute, enchanting humans and animals alike. The bansuri's sound was believed to slice through the illusions of reality, known as Maya, whisking listeners to a higher plane of consciousness. Percussion instruments like the mridangam and tabla weren't just timekeepers. They mirrored the rhythms of life itself, heartbeats, breath, and cosmic cycles. The rhythms, or talas, were complex math patterns, some smooth and cyclical, others delightfully offbeat, each tied to emotions and times of day. Indian music was all about rasa, the idea that music should evoke emotional flavors like love, heroism, calm, or sorrow. Even thousands of years ago, ragas, melodic frameworks, were crafted to stir the soul and guide meditation. Unlike many ancient art forms lost to time, India's musical roots haven't just survived, they've evolved, all while keeping alive the age-old belief that making music is basically a direct hotline to the divine. Meanwhile, across the ocean in ancient Mesoamerica, from the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan to the grand plazas of the Maya and Aztecs, music was sacred business. It wasn't just pretty sounds, it was power itself, used to commune with gods, bless blood offerings, summon rain, and scare off enemies. For Mesoamerican peoples, music was ritual technology, an invisible thread weaving humans, gods, and ancestors together in a cosmic dance that still echoes through time. Drums ruled the sonic kingdom. The superstar, a towering single-headed drum hewn from hollow tree trunks and lovingly played with bare hands. Wrapped in animal skins and decorated with mysterious glyphs or sacred symbols, this drum throbbed with the heartbeat of festivals, battles, and sacrifices alike. Its deep, booming voice echoed through stone courtyards, like the gods themselves tapping their chests in approval. Next up, meet the slit drum, a hollow wooden wonder struck with rubber-tipped mallets. Its surface was carved into two tongues that sang different pitches. But this wasn't just any drum, it was a chatterbox. Legend has it, this drum could speak in the ancient language, singing the names of gods or the very rhythms of destiny. Wind instruments joined the party too. Flutes, crafted from bone, clay, and reed, were common, often shaped like animals or deities. Some were so intricately made they could mimic bird calls, jaguar growls, or even human screams. Yes, screams. The infamous skull-shaped death whistle produced a blood-curdling shriek that could terrify enemies, or perhaps even open doors to the spirit world during war or ritual. Music wasn't background noise, it was the main event, showing up at every life milestone: births, rites of passage, wars, planting seasons, and funerals. Musicians and dancers trained in elite schools, performing not just for the crowd, but for the gods themselves. Certain instruments were sacred, reserved only for nobles or priests, and playing them wrong. Spiritual crime alert. Even sacrifices had a killer soundtrack. Drums pounded, flutes howled, conch shells blared, all while hearts were offered to the sun. The music didn't soothe, it sparked action. It guided souls, fed gods, and kept the universe's wheels turning. In this ancient world, music wasn't just a soundtrack, it was the ceremony. It wasn't made to entertain, it was designed to transform. Though those civilizations have vanished, their music lives on, not always as sound, but in rituals, art, and cultural DNA. Ancient music wasn't meant to be written down or recorded like today's hits. It was passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, heart to heart, a living tradition. Just like some timeless instruments from distant lands, these sounds aren't dusty museum relics. They're alive, still whispering their stories in every beat and breath. They're still rocking the stage today, sometimes with techniques older than your great-great-great-great-grandparents' laundry methods. These performers aren't just playing tunes, they're channeling the ancient groove. Every note is basically a time machine crammed with centuries of deep thought, culture, and meditative vibes. One single pluck on a string and boom, you're suddenly feeling the heartbreak or happiness of an emperor who lived before indoor plumbing. Over in Africa, the drums are still having full-blown conversations. The rhythm of the gamba, the classic back and forth of the go, and that irresistible dance beat, all rooted in traditions that go way further back than borders or history books. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the chilling breath of the Andean siku or the powerful rumble of powwow drums still carry the voices of those who came long before us. Some instruments today are the spitting image of their ancient ancestors. Others are the wild offspring of long-forgotten designs. Either way, they're all tapping into something primal. Even in today's polished pop and orchestras, ancient music is lurking behind the scenes like a quiet but clever producer. That 7-note heptonic scale used in ancient Mesopotamia, yep, it's still laying down the law in modern harmony. Greek music theory, with all its fancy modes, intervals, and ethos, eventually morphed into church chants and, ta-da, classical music and its full instrument parade. The ancient lyre, it got a medieval makeover and became the lute, which later evolved into that rock and roll icon, the guitar, and the olos with its snazzy double reed. Say hello to the oboe and bassoon, woodwinds with ancient swagger. But the real mic drop of ancient music, its purpose. It wasn't about fame, fortune, or viral hits. Music was sacred, it healed, it welcomed babies and bid farewell to the dearly departed. It celebrated the harvest, declared war, made love a little more dramatic. It meant something. Today, music still speaks every language, even the ones we forgot. It tugs at hearts without uttering a word, builds community without needing bricks. In a world jam-packed with bleeps, bloops, and algorithm-approved playlists, ancient music is here to remind us. Sound can still be holy, rhythm can hold memory, and melody might just be the string that ties us to something bigger. So whether it's whispered from a gin, thundered through a war drum, or whistled out of a clay flute, the ancestors are still singing. All we have to do is listen.